Hi everyone, welcome back. This is Professor Hall, and this is 6 more things to know about Charlotte Temple. So my first lecture, I gave you an overview of the book. The second lecture, we talked about historical background and the author. And then in this lecture, we're going to look at literary elements. So things like structure, character, themes, and narration. Let's get started. So, recap. Charlotte is an innocent 15-year-old girl. She's under the care of Madame Dupont at a private school. British Lieutenant John Montraville sees Charlotte, and his friend, his libertine, immoral friend, Belcourt, encourages him to go after Charlotte and run away together. She is hesitant. Her teacher, Mademoiselle Leroux, who's very often just called Leroux for much of this novel, convinces her to elope as soon as they sleep together. It's the old story. He hits it and quits it, basically. Montraville becomes bored with Charlotte. He falls in love with another woman. And at the same time, Charlotte has become pregnant. So Belcourt wants Charlotte as his mistress. He convinces Montraville that she's cheated on him. To try to steal her away. He also can kind of see that Montraville just wants an excuse to leave. So Montraville abandons her. He tells Belcourt to take care of Charlotte, and Belcourt lies, never gives Charlotte the money Montraville left him. And at the same point, Leroux, now Mrs. Creighton, refuses to help Charlotte. So Charlotte is abandoned and alone, and then I'm not spoiling the end. But that is the basic plot of the book. It is a romantic tragedy. So the first thing to know when reading this book is we have what is called an intrusive narrator. I have this little picture here. Story time, children, gather round. I have some important lessons about life to teach you. Blah, 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 blah. Right? This book, I actually quite like the general story. I find the intrusive narrator a bit too intrusive. So the book is written in third person. The narrator breaks into the story to add comments and talk directly to the reader. So when she does that, she's switching from third person to second person. Watch for this strategy because she's trying to increase the sentimental elements of the tale. Last time I talked about sentimentality and seduction novels, and she's trying to make people feel even more emotional. I think that for today's readers, this is one of the reasons that people don't particularly care for this book. You can skim these parts over. You don't have to read them word for word because to me they're annoying, and they're probably annoying to you as well. This is also called being didactic, and I'm gonna write that word while I'm talking. Didactic means that you are trying to teach a lesson in a preachy way. If I can. This is hard to do with a mouse here. Pause with me for 5 more seconds. There we go. Didactic. And for us today, it doesn't work. Like, just tell us the story, right? This happens a lot of times in movies too. Like the lesson, they're trying to pound the moral lesson into your head. And so because of that, the movie isn't as great. Another author and professor, John Pistelli, he's got a great blog on literature. And what he said is, this book has, quote, a preachy but brisk third-person narrator. The novel's narrator is exceedingly interventionist, often sermonizing the reader on the necessity of rectitude and, more intriguingly, of mercy for the penitent unrighteous. In a late chapter, the narrator even reproves the reader for the anticipated objection that Charlotte Temple is melodramatic and tiresome. So, intrusive means that she's breaking into the story to give these little tidbits. There's one chapter that basically is an entire intrusion by the narrator, and then we pick back up. So she'll say things like this. My dear, cheerful, innocent girl, for innocent I will suppose you to be, or you would acutely feel the woes of Charlotte yourself. And then she kind of goes into like chastising this reader of like, if you haven't been like Charlotte, then you should have pity for her. And we know that she has done wrong, but she feels so sorry and she's so heartbroken, on and on and on and on. So just be kind of aware of this technique. Don't worry about reading the narrator's comments too closely. But she's trying to stir up emotion, and she's also trying to make this argument that number one, girls should be better educated. Number two, we should not be like Charlotte and fall into these seductive traps. And then number three, that if we know a girl like Charlotte, we shouldn't treat her like an outcast. 2, flashback to romance. So structurally, this book has a long flashback in chapters 2 through 5. Charlotte is introduced in the first chapter. Then we have 3 chapters of a flashback about how her parents met and married. And then the story of Charlotte picks back up in chapter 6. So why have such a long flashback in such a short book? It's a very interesting structural choice that the author made. And you have to know, again, novels were kind of a new art form. So the idea of playing with structure and having a flashback would have been kind of an interesting one. But I think also that the author is trying to show you the difference between a proper courtship and an improper affair. Charlotte's parents are a love match, meaning they have not been set up by their parents. They are not getting married because they are both of the right station and they have to, right? Instead, as I mentioned before, Charlotte's father is the son of an earl. He's helping Captain Eldridge, and he falls in love with the daughter. When they fall in love, they court each other properly. He makes it very clear that he is going to marry her. And he goes to his father to declare his intentions. And then his father disowns him because he thinks that she's basically too poor to marry. But then he speaks to her father and he says, I don't care about what my father has said. I will make my own way in the world. I will provide a good house and a good family and a good life, and I want Lucy to be my wife. And then he talks to Lucy about the type of house they will have and all of these things. So this is quite unlike Montraville, who meets Charlotte, talks about how beautiful she is, and immediately asks her to run away with him. He is not courting her properly. He's not dating her properly. And, a modern equivalent is the guy who posts pictures of him and a girlfriend on Facebook, but he's secretly sexting somebody else, right? Or calling them for a booty call and keeping that on the low and not publicly saying, I'm in a relationship with this person. That's basically the difference. Except with way harsher consequences. But I think that if we can kind of keep that in mind, then this book seems a lot more, I don't want to say important, but a lot more timely. That this is, having a love and thinking that you're in love, but you're actually just in lust, and being kind of dumped. Being tricked by someone into sleeping with them, being dumped after you sleep with someone, having your heart broken, even if, whether or not sex is involved. These are things that are going on even today. So if you read it in that sense and you kind of ignore some of the intrusions of the narrator, I think then you can see how it's still relevant. A woman with no agency. So this part is I have this picture here, women's agency in modern Britain and the American colonies. And I talked about the author before. The author was quite an empowered woman. She had a lot of choices. She had some money. She started a business, 2 businesses. She was an editor and an author, and she tried to work for social change, for better education, for middle-class girls. But, Charlotte in this book really has no agency at all. Agency means the ability to make decisions. And she's basically tricked and manipulated into making decisions to the extent that we really are like, is she making any decision on her own? Is she actually making a decision? We have, for example, and I think I have an excerpt of this in a moment, but she's in this, she's about to run away with Montraville, and she faints. She goes on the ship, and she is kind of like sick and lying about the cabin instead of living it up and being immoral with this guy. So it's interesting, the differences between the author and the character. But here, this is really, out of all the books we're reading for women's literature, she has the least amount of agency of any of the characters we're going to read. Some critics see Charlotte as like, oh, she's this wonderful heroine and she's going outside the patriarchal structure and against the religious morals in which she was raised, and therefore she should be praised for her actions. I think that that's a misreading of this story. Is she going outside the patriarchal structure? No. No, she's not. The reason that she's not is that it's really this structure that kind of traps her into the position that she's in. So basically, she's doubly punished by the society in which she lives. First, she's punished for abandoning her family for her lover, because once he sleeps with her, he kind of loses interest. Then she's abandoned by him and becomes pregnant, and most of society abandons her at that point and kind of casts her out in a way. So the idea that she's like a brazen heroine who should be admired is not a correct interpretation of the book. But what the author is trying to show first is that we really should prevent this sort of thing from happening. She is in no way praising Charlotte for having sex outside of marriage. That is not what is happening. It is very clear that that is not the right thing to do, according to this author. But she is saying, here's how we can prevent it, possibly through education, and through reading stories like this to see the outcome. And then secondly, when it does happen, these girls are friendless and we should really pity them and help them. And so that's, kind of her double two sides of her argument. But I would like you to watch and read for places where Charlotte herself is not making decisions. And because of that, we really, she's not the villain of the story, and she could be. If you think about something like the Scarlet Letter, where, Hester Prynne has the A on her chest, in that type of a story, the girl would be, shamed for her actions, and here she's really not, because she almost doesn't even make the choice. The evil in men's hearts. So, Charlotte's downfall is not her fault, or at least not completely her fault. I forgot I had the Scarlet Letter here. But, when a woman becomes pregnant, it's quite obvious, and particularly before paternity tests, it's not obvious who the father is. And so therefore, the fathers of these pregnant unwed women could kind of get away with leaving the women in this state and abandoning them and going on with their lives. And that's exactly what happens in this book. So we have Montraville, who mistakes temporary lust for true love, and he kind of becomes more villainous as the story goes on. Now, he's still painted in kind of a sympathetic light. So I'd like you to look for that characterization. Is he a good guy who made a bad choice, or is he a bad guy who continues to make bad choices? He marries a woman who he says he's in love with, but does he marry her for her money? And what are the consequences for his actions? Belcour wants a mistress, and basically is willing to do whatever he can to manipulate her into sleeping with him. So Belcour, even though he's not the father of Charlotte's child, really is painted and characterized more like the villain. He is one of the two antagonists of this story. So I really want you to look for that, how she's depicting these two men. One who is kind of more innocent, and one who is, as they say, a libertine, who is immoral and a seducer. What's interesting also is the fact that these men are punished for their nefarious misdeeds. I don't want to kind of get into what happens to each one of them, because I don't want to do too many spoilers. But yeah, just look for that. Look for how they're punished and who gets what punishment and which one is more deserving of the punishment he gets. So here is an excerpt. Charlotte has just come out of the house with LaRue, and Montraville and Belcour are ready to receive them and run away. "Now," said Montraville, taking Charlotte into his arms, "you are mine forever." "No," said she, withdrawing from his embrace. "I am come to take an everlasting farewell." It would be useless to repeat the conversation that here ensued. Suffice it to say that Montraville used every argument that had been formerly successful. Charlotte's resolution began to waver, and he drew her almost imperceptibly toward the shay. That's the carriage. "I cannot go," said she. "Cease, dear Montraville, to persuade. I must not. Religion, duty forbid." "Cruel Charlotte," said he, "if you disappoint my ardent hopes, by all that is sacred, this hand shall put a period to my existence. I cannot, will not, live without you." "Alas, my torn heart," said Charlotte, "how shall I act?" "Let me direct you," said Montraville, lifting her into the shay. "Oh, my dear forsaken parents," cried Charlotte. The chaise drove off. She shrieked and fainted into the arms of her betrayer. So what do we have in this scene? Well, first, that Belcour is there and so is LaRue, and they're kind of out of the rest of this scene. But we'll look at LaRue in a moment. But basically what is happening here is coercion. And if you have looked up the definition of that before, it is a type of rape. She's saying no, and he is trying to coerce her into coming anyway. Now, this isn't exactly to sleep with him, but that is the implication that will happen soon. They're getting in the carriage and then driving off to the ship that will take them to America. So she's coming down to say goodbye to him before he leaves for America. He convinces her to go, and she says that she doesn't want to, and she says, "No, I cannot go. I dare not. My religion, my duty to my family, to my friends." And what does he do? He threatens to kill himself. And then she allows herself to be lifted into the carriage, and then she faints. So the manipulation here is appalling and would have been extremely appalling to readers, right? But this is part of his seduction. He's trying to seduce her. He's taking her into his arms. She says no and tries to push away. He tries to use arguments that have worked on her in the past when she also didn't want to meet with him because she was afraid and knew that it wasn't right. And then when he finally thinks that she's going to leave him, he threatens to commit suicide. So, well, if you leave me, I'm going to kill myself. That's basically what he's saying here. And then we see her not really making a choice and fainting. So the guilt of the situation really is placed on Montraville in this scene. In other scenes, it's placed a little bit more on Belcour, so you need to watch for that too. But even, oh, there we go. There's a woman fainting. And here's the modern equivalent. Is he manipulating you or guilting you into sex? This is from a website for college students getting advice. If you love me I love you so much, and if you love me as much as I love you, you'd have sex. If he says anything that remotely resembles that sentence, it's probably time to start rethinking this relationship. If he loved you as much as he says he does, he would respect the boundaries you have set. And I will say, there's an equal thing for guys. I'm not ready for sex, but she is. And basically the same advice, right? So that's what's happening here. She's like, no, and he's like, I love you so much. If you loved me, you'd sleep with me. And she falls for it. But even more than just these two men are the evil in women's hearts. I Googled sexy teacher. That's the picture that came up. And I put it together with this quote. If the teacher be corrupt, the world will be corrupt. That's a Persian proverb. And possibly more importantly, in this story, the author is almost saying, like, no offense, guys, but we kind of expect men to behave in this way. But the real issue here is also women hurting other women. Mademoiselle LaRue is a teacher, and she should be a mentor figure or a second mother to Charlotte. But instead, she encourages Charlotte to have loose morals, to be libertine like she is, and knows that this will probably lead to the girl's ruin. And then she refuses to help Charlotte once trouble strikes. It's really not clear why she does this. She herself had a bad love affair in the past. Does she want to corrupt Charlotte for her own gain in some way, or bring Charlotte down to her level, make Charlotte corrupt? It's really not entirely clear what her motives are. We know at one point that she's bribed by Montraville, so money is a slight motive, but that's not the only reason. And as you're reading, really kind of think about her motivations. Why do you think she's doing what she's doing? In either case, the author is trying to warn female readers to be wary, don't associate with the wrong people, particularly women of poor moral character. They might look glamorous at first, but they're really rotten on the inside, and they will lead you down a path of destruction. Her other argument, again, is for better education. And I will say this, Mademoiselle LaRue and Mademoiselle Dupont are French. The author was British. So there is a sense here of, like, we have this bad foreign French influence, and they don't have the same sexual morals that we have. And if you allow your young girls to be influenced by these people, they will go down the wrong path. That's basically part of her argument. So here is our second excerpt. This is before they run away. Sorry to show you this out of order. And Charlotte has just met with Montraville at night, and LaRue was with Belcourt, and now they're coming back to the school. So, I don't intend to go again, said Charlotte, gravely taking off her bonnet and beginning to prepare for bed. I am sure if Madame Dupont knew we had been out tonight, she would be very angry, and it is 10 to 1, but she hears of it by some means or another. Nay, miss, said LaRue, perhaps your mighty sense of propriety might lead you to tell her yourself, and in order to avoid the censure you would incur, she would hear of it by accident, throw the blame on me. So, in other words, Charlotte's saying, Madame Dupont's going to find out about this. I better tell her. I'm not going out again. LaRue's saying, oh, I'm sure that you're just going to go and tell on me, and I'm going to get blamed, and then you're going to avoid punishment. So she continues, I confess I deserve it. It will be a very kind return for that partiality which led me to prefer you before any of the rest of the ladies. But perhaps it will give you pleasure, continued she, letting fall some hypocritical tears, to see me deprived of bread, and for an action which by the most rigid could only be esteemed an inadvertency, lose my place and character, and be driven again into the world where I have already suffered all the evils attendant on poverty. This was touching Charlotte in the most vulnerable part. She rose from her seat and took Mademoiselle's hand. So here, again, we see Charlotte being manipulated. LaRue is hypocritically crying. So she's got fake crocodile tears. And she's like, I gave you partiality. I preferred you more than any of the other girls at this school. So I showed you kindness and I did favors for you. And now you're going to tell on me and I'll be kicked out. I'll be deprived of bread. I won't have any money. I won't have any food. And here I think is the key. I won't have a reputation and I'll be driven out again into the world. So this idea of character comes up a second time later in the novel once she is married to Colonel Creighton. And her fear of being driven out into the world and being impoverished, which she is trying to work her way out of by being a teacher. She's kind of gotten into the middle class slightly by being a teacher. And Charlotte, of course, feels bad and is manipulated and believes her and takes Mademoiselle's hand. And if she had been properly educated or without this influence, she would never have gone off with Montraville. If she had a better teacher or mentor, that teacher would say, oh, that young man is not addressing you properly. We shall not speak to him again. Or if you want to talk to that young man, he had better come to the school where you would have a chaperone in the light of day and not at night, undercover, secretly, like a booty call, right? That's basically what would have happened. So really, I think it's interesting that it's not just a story. This is not like a pure feminist story where, like, you know, the way that people think of feminists where the men are bad and the women are good. All four of these people play their own part. Charlotte by not making decisions and by being too naive and by being easily manipulated. The men by being seductors, and Mademoiselle Dupont by not being a proper caretaker. All right, so the love affair gone sour. There is a lot in this novel about the differences between lust and love. And I love this little graphic here, just in case you didn't know. Lust takes away, it's impatient, it violates, it's self-centered, it's greedy, it's disloyal, it abandons. Love gives, waits, respects, forgives, it's generous, it protects, it's faithful, it upholds. At the beginning of the novel, we have Charlotte, a beautiful, innocent girl, and a handsome man in Montraville falling in love, supposedly. She's shy, he's a little awkward, so her teacher and his best friend help play matchmaker and get these two kids together. You could see this being a rom-com, and certainly the seduction novel is a tragedy, but it made way for the romance and the romantic comedy. It's part of that genre and kind of the beginning part of that genre in terms of novels. It's not love in this case. It's just a passing fancy. It's lust. It's very self-centered and greedy. Montraville is taking her away, endangering her, and then later he abandons her, right? So he's impatient. You have to come with me now. You have to leave with me tonight. I'm not waiting for you. This is kind of, I compared it to Romeo's Rosalind before he met Juliet. If you remember in the play, he's going on and on and on about Rosalind, how much he loved her and how much he misses her. And then he sees Juliet and he immediately forgets her, right? So a passing fancy of something that is not real. And when we see Charlotte's parents, we see this list over here. Charlotte's father is respectful, he's forgiving, he's unselfish and generous to Mr. Eldridge. He waits, he protects Lucy, he defends her against his father, and it is very, very clear that there's a difference. What's interesting is that in this love affair that's gone bad, Does Montreville actually love Julia Franklin? That's something to kind of watch for and answer yourself. But the second half of the story, because this is not a love story, it's a lust story. Heartbroken parents. A woman kept, I put an apartment, but it's a house. A woman kept alone with a man who's disgusted by her. He falls in love with another woman. He's racked with guilt. LaRue, eventually her looks fade to dust, and so she doesn't have her feminine wiles anymore. And I want you to think about, as you're reading, how this is set up like a traditional romance that we would see on the screen or read today, and then how your expectations are kind of changed by the author and how this gets turned into tragedy. So that's our 6 things. There we go. True tests of true love. I'm tripping over my words. Things to consider while you read. Sentimentality. Where are emotions high, and how do the reader's sympathies, how are they played upon? How would a middle-class schoolgirl feel reading this story? Really think about the tone and the emotions at play. Why is the book so popular among young ladies? Feminism. Where do women lack power? Where does the author call for a better life for women? Education. How are women being educated in both academics and social mores? So their moral education as well as their academic education. And how are those systems failing young women? Social structures. We talked about a lot last time. How are men and women held back by their social caste? How is life easier for the wealthy? And could it be better for those in the middle or lower classes? What can we do as readers to help people like the non-working poor? How can we see as readers how the ways in which having money allows someone to have a little bit more stability in their life? Love affairs. Again, the difference between proper love and a tainted or morally corrupt affair. And finally, moral corruption. Who is right? Who is negligent? And who is actually corrupt? How is each person punished for their wrongs? Really think about those things. Look at the interesting characterization. It's not a long book, but I think it's kind of a good one to start off with. And then we'll look at other books later in the semester that have women with a little bit more agency and empowerment, a little bit more and more as we go. So for this one, these are the things to consider, and I look forward to seeing your thoughts on the book. Thanks, everybody.